Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're going to be presenting on emergency procurement, special considerations in the Multilateral Development Bank's finance operations. And my name is Kim Fan. I will be serving as your moderator today. I'm the Executive Director of the International Law Institute. This talk is a part of our ILI COVID series, which we've put together to help our alumni and friends around the world be able to deal with COVID from a special angle. And as we know, there's a lot of funds that have been committed by the Multilateral Development Bank to address COVID. And this morning's speaker, today's speaker, needs no introduction. It is Dr. Bernard Beck. Bernard was the Chief of Procurement Policy Officer for the World Bank, and he also serves as the Senior Advisor and Course Advisor for the International Law Institute. During this time, we will actually be offering a couple of courses on procurement. We will have procurement consulting services online, and then in person, we will have the International Public Procurement course, followed by the Country Procurement course, and Procurement Audit, and finally Procurement Integrity, investigating and prosecuting procurement fraud. So we hope to see you online again or in Washington, D.C. at the International Law Institute. So let me welcome Dr. Bernard Beck.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you to you and all at the ILI for the opportunity to present this webinar. I will structure this in about 3 parts. The first one, very quickly to present the broader context of MDB's involvement in emergency situations. The focus today will be on the response and recovery phase of emergencies, not the preparedness, not the reconstruction and rehabilitation thereafter. And that is where emergency procurement takes place when the emergency has stricken the country. One caveat is that there is a particular issue relating to weak capacity of procuring agencies in a number of countries. For a number of reasons, and oftentimes because the implementation of the public procurement framework is not up to par. So procuring in a truly emergency situation may also overlap with situation of weak capacity, and you will see that that triggers a number of responses from MDBs. So what are the principles and the type of actions that MDBs have taken? And I am putting this into the broader context of their intervention. You have to remember that MDBs were basically created to reconstruct and rehabilitate. So it meant that most of the projects were really large infrastructure projects, and they were not created to respond to emergencies. Okay, so starting at the beginning of the century, around 2005, 2006, there was increased demand for engagement of MDBs in general and other donors, other international financial institutions, into more comprehensive responses to emergencies. So that has meant really a shifting approach for institutions which were known for putting together good, well-prepared projects, but not to be able to respond quickly to emergencies. So that meant to a number of ways to respond. And the first way was really to scale up or restructure existing projects with supplemental financing or additional financing, and in particular focusing on budget support, because when an emergency was striking in a given country, oftentimes the main first issue was lack of financial resources. So the bank started to move towards more scaling up, providing more resources, but not necessarily respond like UN agencies were in case of emergencies. So what that meant was really to try to focus on how to streamline and accelerate project processing, in particular the supplemental or additional financing. That meant going faster, delegating authority, clearer reviews, faster reviews, etc. So it was more of an internal churning of how to be able to move money more quickly to borrowers. That meant also helping these borrowers to move through the complex process of getting loans or credits or grant approved and then effective. And then the last one is really to come up with a strategy, in particular from the fiduciary point of view, and how to streamline. Of course, again, the fiduciary mandate, which is to make sure that the monies, the proceeds are used for the intended purposes, require a lot of oversight. And therefore, this was a bit inconsistent with speed, which is of the essence when you have an emergency. The other main answer from MDBs has been on the financial side and providing greater financing flexibility. And one of them, of course, is retroactive financing. Typically, when there is a loan, a credit, or a grant, there is a limited amount of proceeds which can go to activities which were already started. Retroactive financing meant that in case of emergency situation, the percentage of these proceeds could be increased in the case of the bank up to 40%. Fast disbursing loans or credit based on positive lists of goods or activities to address future emergencies also to cover. And they were basically allowing government to import or to procure locally what they needed to address an emergencies. Another angle was to extend the set of eligible expenditures. That also goes into what I was saying about moving from large infrastructure project to projects which were considering other type of expenditures. One aspect also is that in most loans, and depending on complex criteria, there is a certain level of counterpart funding. And in case of emergency, sometimes this will be released to allow governments not to have to come up with this counterpart funding. And project preparation facility is one common tool used by MDBs to help prepare a project. And that again has also been gradually increased. For instance, at the World Bank, up to $10 million could be used. For those who don't know, a project preparation facility is an amount of money which is given to the government to help prepare project, and then after it's incorporated into the subsequent loan or credit. Okay, and the objective is really to start up. So the main focus was really more on the financial side and on the type of investment instruments which could be used. Now, now I'm going to focus more on what is emergency procurement. What does it entail? What are the key features and characteristics? Okay. So of course, flexibility and speed are of the essence, and that is to be able to mitigate the impact. Second, fit-for-purpose arrangements and procedural managerial rules to conduct public procurement processes. So it's the whole environment within which procurement is carried out. The third one is you need to adjust the procurement methods and procedures to be able to be reactive and to provide a quick response. Of course, that is the mantra in public procurement, provided that they are consistent with good principles. And the last aspect is really the typical oversight, in particular of the MDBs, which is fairly heavy-handed, so to speak, need to be fathomed to the particular emergency situation. That doesn't mean that there is no accountability, and one of the ways to ensure that you can have this accountability is to have proper record keeping, as we will see. So what are the options to handle public procurement effectively and in a timely manner? And I have divided here in 4 different aspects. First, the legal and regulatory framework. Second, institutional arrangements, in particular public sector management and public procurement point of view. The third one is procedural, which is more how those agencies of government which are to conduct procurement, how do they manage in emergency situations? And the last part, which I will spend more time about, is what sort of methods and procedures you can use. Now, one of the key points to always remember in this is that, okay, time is of the essence, you need to expedite, but that doesn't mean that anything goes. So you always need to consider what is reasonable and justifiable, in particular when the funds come from an MDB, because the fiduciary mandate will still have to be exercised, emergency situation or not. So that is always something to keep in mind to really have the proper institutional and procedural arrangements to handle emergencies. So let's start with the legal and regulatory framework. The first thing is that the country must include provisions in its framework and in the procurement, public procurement law in particular, special arrangements for emergency situations. And that needs to be very well ironed out to avoid potential abuse by some agencies. One of the main elements to deal with is the possibility to outsource the management of public procurement. Another one is to have spatial authorization and delegation of authority and decision making. And of course, you need special timelines, methods and procedures, and we will see how this works. This being said, you will always need to have provisions which describe how to come back to normalcy, quote unquote, given that when you are in an emergency situation, and in particular because you have more flexible procurement arrangement, that creates more risks, and in particular from the fiduciary and financial control point of view. And finally, in particular, when you have regular emergencies striking countries, you really need to regularly reassess whether your legal and institutional framework is set to provide the correct or the effective and efficient provisions for procuring agencies to really work in this context. The next one deals with institutional arrangements, and I have split it in 3 parts. First, generic options. One is to outsource core government services, which are critical to public procurement, and that may have to do with financial management, any other public sector management, and in particular when you have a pandemic related to health. And we'll see in the next one how that can be done. You can strengthen contract management by having contract management service provider. They can be management contractor, contract managers. In public procurement, we have different definitions for those, but that is one way to do it. And in particular, when you have emergencies which are related to natural disaster, where you have the need for urgent repairs and rehabilitation. And the last one is really specific arrangements or agreements to support procuring agencies, and that's where banks may be very useful to provide technical assistance or other advice. Okay, so among these institutional arrangements, the first one is procurement agents. Provided that there is a specified duration and that you rely on qualified companies to do so. Now, as time is of the essence, sometimes you need interim solutions, and it can be to mobilize individual consultants. And we will see also later that some of the banks may provide support until you have procurement agents being able to run out the procurement. These are particularly useful in cases where you really have a weak capacity in the country. What comes handy is to have pre-identified list of procurement agents. Another point to make here is that we have to be really careful on the type of contracts you are using, and time-based contracts can be very costly in the end. So it's rather a good idea to have contract payment terms more based on a percentage fee related to the number of processes and transactions that will take place. And our experience was really that the procurement agents works well if, of course, you have these conditions I have laid out, but also if they are provided with an early list of what it is that they are going to have to do, list of contracts. Now, another one, which I think is really important, and to me, when it comes to emergency, is one of the main institutional arrangement that governments need to consider, and that is to rely on UN, United Nations agencies and programs. Most of them are agencies. Programs is because UNICEF, for instance, is originally a program. And UNDP, World Food Program, UNHCR, UNFPA, FAO, WHO, and some of them, of course, are particularly important in the case of a pandemic like we have now with the COVID-19. Now, this being said, they are not all able to do everything. So relying on UN agencies should really be linked to the fact that they are uniquely positioned, specialized, and qualified. So I will take just the example of UNICEF, which is the one UN agency which has the upper hand in terms of vaccines and other type of drugs. And it's very clear that they are really uniquely positioned. They have engaged in a number of activities which have positioned themselves uniquely in the procurement of these drugs and vaccines. But that doesn't mean that another UN agency is as well placed to do the same thing. The second point is that it's really important to have early consultation. So UN agencies are usually on the ground, but what we have found out in the MDBs was that having negotiated pre-agreements and forms of contracts to engage them during emergencies is really the way to go, because there is no time when the emergencies try to start negotiating with them. Of course, they are recruited when it comes to MDB financing on a single source selections. They have immunities and privileges, and they are not competing with others. And hence the importance of the uniquely positions and specialized and qualified. It may take different forms: direct implementation of activities, supply of critical health-related goods, which is what the issue is now with COVID-19. But they're also very often involved either as contractors, food forward program, for instance, or contract managers, to build shelters, emergency public facility rehabilitation, and so on. And of course, they may be providing technical expertise of, or advice, like rapid damage and needs assessment, recovery strategy, and so on and so forth. So the scope of what they can do is large, but also should be very contained. And I'll move. The third one is that in case of emergency, you can rely on NGOs, and typically because they have their feet on the ground and they are really aware of local idiosyncrasies. They may be very well accepted by communities, and therefore they may be in a position to procure what is needed in case of emergency. And linked to it is international humanitarian depot, and they are not necessarily UN. The UN operates some, but some are different. So they are really very important, in particular when you have very low capacity locally to procure bids. They may be also very important when you have a dysfunctional market or an asymmetric market, like what is going on now with the COVID-19 and the dearth of a certain number of equipment or drugs. And again, like with the UN agencies, it works better if they have been pre-negotiated in some ways between governments and those in charge of this depot to ensure that everything goes smoothly and quickly when an emergency strikes. Third part is what I've called procedural arrangements. And that is really what can be done to expedite the procurement processes. And the first one is really to have quick and simple templates to assess public procurement market and risks. It's not because it's an emergency that you cannot do this. Of course, market analysis and risk assessment are the bread and butter of project preparation for MDBs. But when an emergency strikes, you may have to revisit, and there are ways to do this fairly quickly. The second one is regarding procurement planning. Procurement planning is really of the essence anyway. No good procurement planning, no early procurement planning means trouble down the line in the procurement cycle. So, of course, it's particularly critical in that case, and also to monitor what has been going on in implementation. Another key element during emergencies in bulk procurement. Of course, that is always something to consider, but depending on the country, the fact that it can be done centralized in a centralized manner, and of course relying on e-government procurement platforms is important. But the whole idea is here to aggregate needs from end users and avoid pseudo competition and increasing, in fact, the dysfunctional asymmetric market, as we see during this COVID-19 pandemic. Very important is the packaging of works and non-consulting services based on local market, and the packaging of goods both from the local and international capacity. That's one thing to remember during an emergency, is that non-consulting services and works tend to be better provided locally, even if it's a foreign firm operating in the country, while goods is, of course, footloose, so to speak, and therefore allows to procure from almost anywhere in the world. Also, there are conditions, as we will see. Risk management during an emergency, that's one thing which needs to be paid specific attention to. And in particular, because you are going to rely on particular processes, methods, and procedures. So that can be abused, or you may have non-compliance with what the legal and regulatory framework I talked about earlier is providing for. There is always the risk that bidders do not understand the specific terms of the bids and the specification and standards, which are different or may be different during an emergency. You need both quality and timely delivery. So that is an element which is very critical, because they are hard to combine. And of course, corruption and price fixing, which you need to pay attention to. So these may be monitored, or should be monitored, and may be controlled. And one of the ways to involve all key stakeholders in the process, which is one of the elements of how public procurement has evolved, which is broader involvement of stakeholders and civil society at large. One important thing is also to limit the scope and the value and length, duration of the contracts. So you really want to focus on the most immediate effects of the emergency. You don't use emergency procedures to rehabilitate bridges which have been in trouble for already 5 years. Not that it should not be, but you don't use the emergency procedures for this. There is a difference. You may also ensure bidders that there are resources, and that is particularly important when you have MDB or other financiers behind, because that gives some confidence to the potential bidders. And the last point I will make here is that it's really critical to plan for audits to ensure that whichever methods and procedures have been used, they have been compliant. And the last one is really an operational procurement. And that is what I'm going to focus on now, which is what are the specific methods and procedures? It's not necessarily that they are unique to emergency, but there are those which are going to be called upon more often when you have an emergency, whatever you're talking about. And that is for works, good, non-consulting, or consulting services. The first thing is that you need to know which conditions under which they may be used, any one of them. And all will always require a proper justification. Remember, it's not because it's an emergency that anything goes. Everything needs to be justified and thought through. It's not because you use flexibility and you want to have fit for purpose that any method or procedure is fit for a particular situation. And all what I said about planning and market analysis and so on. Now, in country legal framework, you need to have these provisions which authorize special, simplified, quicker procurement method and procedures. And that may include the revisiting of the thresholds above which or under which some can be used. Typically, the simpler, quicker methods, as we will see, like direct contracting or quotations, they cannot be used above a relatively limited threshold. That's when, under emergency, those can be raised, so that this quicker method can be used more often. You always need to have checks and balances and qualified bidders, which are fit for the task. Basically, the sacrosanct responsiveness principle of public procurement. And you can rely on the roster of potential bidders and consultants in a given process. And the last one is, it's no time to put together an e-government procurement system, but of course, when you have one, that allows to procure quicker. Be it electronic reverse auction, catalogs, or framework agreements that we will see, that allows to go much quicker. Okay, so what are these methods Again, first, direct contracting. So that is when you can pick either a contractor, a supplier, or a service provider. But think about it this way, is also that you may consider this as extending existing contracts or use force account, which is particularly for works when a special government-owned unit is uniquely placed to carry out some work. That is very often the case for some utilities, and in particular in emergencies to restore power or access to water supply. And for consultants, single source selection. So that's the first one which comes in mind. The second one is limited or restrictive, yet competitive bidding. And that's a simple request for quotations, also known as shopping, and for consultant qualification selections. Typically, you are talking here about simple contracts and small values, but that's again, in case of emergency, it can be increased. Now, framework agreements is the next one, standby arrangements and pre-negotiated contracts and commercial practices. So let me go through those. And here I have a slide where I focus mostly on goods because that's the most critical aspect during this pandemic. So direct contracting, shopping for procuring readily available off-the-shelf goods, and we've seen that it's one of the things which has been difficult here. Open or restrictive competitive bidding with simplified procedure and documentation. And one important element, which is eventually second-hand goods. That is not particularly relevant in the case of a pandemic, but in emergencies in general, it is. Provided, of course, you have overall value for money. And there are a number of conditions and specific bidding and contract provisions. This is fairly well known. There is literature on this. I'm not going to expand, but they are really important. Now, what are the specific provisions on goods? Port clearing, receipt and inspection, storage and distribution. The whole logistic chain is really particularly important in emergency situations. So these need to be prepared upstream before the emergency strikes, but they're, because of the potential abuse, ensuring that they are taken care of is really important. Framework agreement, I want to spend a little bit more time because that is really essential. And that was one of the reasons. Of course, public procurement has been evolving is always evolving, but in particular in the last 10 years. And if you look now at how e-government procurement systems have been put in place, the platforms, how effective they are now, they make framework agreements even more effective and efficient. Okay, so there are various models, but they all have a common feature. Usually, they are not to exceed a certain number of years. You set maximum aggregate amounts, which are to be coherent with risks. They are usually open to a minimum number of firms, and of course, depending on the complexity of what you are bidding, will require a bidding process more or less complicated. Two, you need for it to be operating to have a minimum number of firms, and that is the first stage where you will have a competitive process where you will pre-select, so to speak, a number of firms for the preset duration of the framework agreement. And then after, you can go in the second stage with the so-called call-offs, which are repetitive procurement processes, and that can be effective throughout. Now, there are really many different ways to do it. They can be open, which means that anybody can join, or they can be closed where it's set for the number of years, or you can have mixed bags of things. But they're all based on this two-stage approach, so to speak. So what is key for emergency procurement, and why are they really interesting? First, they are really ready to use because they are basically long-term agreements with the private sector firms. They save time because the call-offs are easy to rely upon, and you can do it when it's needed. You don't have to go through a competitive bidding, so they are really fit for emergency. They are based on estimates of volume and demand, but they are not binding, although they have a pricing structure. So that gives you the flexibility to determine the specific requirements for each call-off stage, but you're operating within a pricing structure. And we see how important that can be during an emergency. You can use them to do the bulk procurement. You can procure for a host of agencies for the government. And in case of emergencies, most public administration will require similar types of goods or services. And you always retain the ability to launch other competitive procurement processes. So they really provide this flexibility we are talking about when talking about an emergency. And of course, you are saving money. I mean, the whole experience is that use of framework agreements is saving money for governments, and basically because of the economies of scale. And of course, it has also an impact on the economy, of the national economy. Positive list, quickly. So they are specified, imported on locally produced goods. They have been very common in quick disbursing components of MDB finance project. Of course, there are conditions for the release of financial tranches, but they have been very popular, and actually they have been used for a long time. And as I said at the beginning, it used to be a time when it was basically the only answer MDBs had for emergencies. So they are in response to identify the needs. What's important is that they need to be monitored, both from a quantitative and qualitative indicators. So typically, you really need to have an audit trail of the contracting, of the prices, and how the funds were used. It can be based on established commercial practices of the private sector or national emergency procedures. And what is important is that it always needs to be documented. And in particular, if they are imported, then you need to have all the paperwork from customs. So it's in case of emergency, it really is a very effective method because it allows for quick import or purchase of local goods which are necessary to respond to the emergencies. Okay. There are some of the others I've done, but here I focused on what is the most important. To complete on that section, let me say a couple of words on the public procurement procedures. First one is pre-qualification and post-qualification. Of course, you can increasingly rely on post-qualification for the restricted and limited bidding. You still have some degree of competition for some of the contract, so you can do post-qualification, or you have simplified pre-qualification process. But the best way here, really, in case of a true emergency, is having already established list of pre-qualified suppliers. It's more difficult for works, but for supply, where you have standard specs, in particular for off-the-shelf goods, that's a good way to go. Okay. Of course, if you have to advertise, it should be a very short advertising period and rely on websites. That's where e-government comes also handy. Definitely reduce standard time for bidding or proposal preparation, depending on the work. If there is a standstill period, which is a time between the evaluation of the bids and the award, you could eliminate it. And of course, there are a number of bidding provisions which you can do away with. For instance, having a bid securing declaration in lieu of a bid security, performance guarantees, amounts and performance security not mandatory, advance payment for the total price, and so there are a number of ways to expedite. And the final one here, you need to make sure that in an emergency you have a proper administration process to manage. How to issue bids quickly, fees, receipt of bids, storage, opening and recording of the bid, and so on and so forth. That is always true, but if you have an expedited process, it needs to be put in place. Better to have a special standard bidding document, and in particular, making sure there are clauses allowing for variation of quantities. We're talking about goods here also, when you have a higher than the contract price. Forms of contracts, I alluded to it before. Reimbursable cost plus fee is a good form of contract to use in these cases. Settlement of dispute, that's one where you may agree to have national commercial arbitration procedures. They are usually not good because sometimes they hamper foreign participation and competition if the regulations are not so good in the country, but in case of emergencies, that could be more acceptable. For medical supply contracts, delivery directly to critical areas, so the management of the logistics is put on the suppliers, and that may be really useful when you have weak capacity locally. Making sure you have pre-shipment inspection and testing, and local independent verification at delivery. This is really important to avoid getting poor quality supplies. And in particular for health supplies, you need strict qualification criteria for the suppliers. You cannot, you have an emergency, in particular pandemic, you cannot add insult to injury by having substandard products. So you have the conformity certificates, registration requirements, and so on. So these are very important. Maybe I think before we move to the next one, you wanted to have a little pause, Kim, for maybe questions?
Yes, Bernard. And thank you for going through the nitty and gritty details of the characteristics of emergency procurement. We do have several questions. And actually, we have quite a bit of people who joined us. And so let me just use this opportunity to welcome some of our old friends and colleagues from the African Development Bank, and also from the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, the Caribbean Development Bank, and the Arab Gulf Funds. And also to welcome say hello to some of our old friends from throughout the world, and particularly from my second home country, Nigeria. So here is a question for you. So the MDBs now find themselves between very stretched UN agencies, especially the WHO, and a very volatile and dynamic market characterized by fluctuating prices, shortage of supply, transportation, and logistics challenge. In your view, how do you think the situation may be best addressed?
My own personal view, and I don't wear any hat, or if people think I have, I should take it off. I think that the banks are better placed for the phases before and after in some ways, because that's more of their business model. I think as we will see in the second part, in the last part, I think UN agencies have, when it comes really to emergencies, they have more boots on the ground in some ways, or rather than more boots on the ground, they have a business model which allows their boots on the ground to be probably more responsive or quickly responsive. And that is because they have 60 years of experience with this. In particular, UNICEF, UNFPA, UNHCR, when it comes to health related. The WHO is a bit of a different issues because they are more of the, I mean, they are very important because there are those who create the standards and the certification and so on. But in terms of being able to act, so that's why I think that sort of mobilization is really important. Now, as we will see, I'll respond to in part with what I'm going to cover in the next one, and what is with the example of the World Bank and what it is trying to do. And I would say the jury is a little bit out because, you know, this pandemic came, and so there was really great efforts to come up with new ways to handle, but the jury is still a bit out.
Okay, thank you, Bernard. So let me ask you this question. So if reserve procurement was specified in the loan agreement in which the bank loan cannot be used, can the bank waive the restrictions on funding for the reserve procurement in an emergency situation if the borrower can demonstrate its inability to provide own reserve procurement as listed in the loan agreement?
Yes, I think the answer would be yes in most cases. And as we will see, the structure of the financing agreements has changed in many ways, and it has, although procurement plans and the description of methods are still in the financing agreements, it's easier to amend. And there are specific provisions in general that when you have an emergency, there are a certain number of things which can be done, which could not be done under a regular project.
Okay, so this is a multi-part question. So you talked about procurement planning, but emergency is supposed to be unexpected and so unplanned. So how can you incorporate this into your plan? And also for emergency procurement, which needs to be dealt with immediately, the advertising can be a long process and can aggravate the emergency condition. So what is the best form to secure or arrange funding for emergency?
Right. You know, procurement planning is always of the essence. What I meant here is to say, you know, avoid ad hoc procurement. And that means a minimum of planning. And that can be done in a day or two. It's not anything else but really aggregating needs and demands, packaging in different lots or whatever, because you know your market. So it's basically, you know, a bit of desk work to update your market analysis and your planning. And it's something which can be done, you know, within a few days, and which avoid that the Department of Health, in particular in federal states, you know, where one state Department of Health is doing this, one the other, while, you know, some sort of planning and aggregation can be done. So that's what is meant. We are not talking about the strategic planning that needs to be done to use public procurement as a strategic function of government and public administration. So that's in that sense. There was a second part to the question?
The second part was just the advertising could prolong.
Yes, the advertising. Yeah, you can really reduce time. But my hunch is, you know, in the next 5 to 10 years, governments will establish or will have established e-procurement platform of sorts. Many already have. And so this issue of the shorter advertising, when e-government platform will be increasingly used, framework agreements and so on, will kind of disappear. At this point, of course, if we talk about the MDB's policy, the specific procedures which can be used is basically not to advertise, be it only because you can rely on direct contracting or quotations, and that can be done in one day. But if you rely on some sort of restricted bidding, then you can cut short. If you have pre-established list of suppliers in particular, then you can give a few days. And works, of course, you're not talking about a large works where you have 2 months. We're talking about repair, reopening. The rehabilitation, the reconstruction, that's the phase after when you can rely on the real one. Take the example of roads. What you need is that they have debris in the middle, you need to clear that. That's a few days work, and that could be done with either pre-qualified, established list of pre-qualified contractors, some sort of framework agreements, whatever type of things like this. And if you open bids, they should be for very simple bill of quantities, and that can be expedited in a few days as well.
Thank you, Bernard. That was very insightful. There's a couple of questions in this section. I'm just going to ask one more, and I'm going to reserve the unanswered question to the end of your presentation.
Okay.
So the question is, the risk inherent in emergency procurement are many. How do you deal with emergency suppliers who may not necessarily be suppliers but have access to goods you need and have entered into a collusive arrangements with known suppliers to hoard the item in need and hike the price?
Well, I think there is no real answer to that question, in the sense that and we've seen it everywhere with this COVID-19 pandemic, is that some companies, even some people, have been able to hoard on some supplies, and then therefore, because of the asymmetric dysfunctional market, they can charge a higher price. The only answer to this, again, I think, is and of course, a lot of the answer is in preparedness, where you have the proper stocks. But again, I would come back to, I don't want to sound like I'm advertising the UN agencies, because these stocks, I think there would be discussion between MDBs, bilateral donors, on how to be able to constitute some stocks. I think the UN agencies may be well placed to manage this, but there may be other options. And the only thing I can see to avoid this would be to have internationally managed some sort of humanitarian depots I talked about. They exist. To expand them, I think it would be really the only way. The other thing I would point out is that I really think the MDB should take the lead in conducting analysis of how some suppliers or some service providers may have abused the situation, and investigate, of course. And we have very clear principles and also procedures to investigate and eventually use sanctions against those which may have colluded. And I'm sure there will be, or there may be now, discussion between INT at the World Bank and the corresponding departments in the other MDBs to investigate. I'm not privy to what is going on, but I would not be surprised that the forensic investigation of these things have already started.
Mm. Well, before you move on, I actually do have just one more question for you to answer in this section. And it comes to you from your old friend, Ashraf. So given the crisis, few countries have decided—
Good morning, Ashraf. Or afternoon.
Yes. So given the crisis, few countries have decided to completely suspend the use of their public procurement law, which makes the consideration of budget support by MDBs for these countries extremely difficult. How do you think the situation can be handled, especially with the fiduciary risk involved?
I think it's a real difficult one to address if they have simply suspended the application of public procurement rules without having any provision if they're national laws or else, because as I'm always teaching in the ILI courses, you really need to look at the public procurement legal and regulatory framework, not from the single point of view of the national public procurement law, but also any other around. So the first thing we really need to know, what is the legality, so to speak, of such measures. You know, for the MDBs, you know, the budget support is really the natural thing. We have gone over the last 30 years increasingly into that dimension. And of course, they are based on the assumption that the public procurement frameworks are not only solid and robust from a principles point of view, but also that they are implemented properly, and which we know is not, is oftentimes where the issues are. So they are predicated upon this, and the release of tranches may even be related to sorting out issues in public procurement. So it's a bit of a conundrum here. You are stuck. You are probably talking about countries which have low capacity of procuring. They become desperate, so they release. But if it's illegal, then it puts the MDBs in a very difficult situation because the risks are involved. And so the first tool, which is, and it would be true also of supplemental financing or additional financing or anything like this. That may be where, that's definitely where increased supplemental financing, because that's a term we use for budget support, is not the best option, when in fact, usually it is in terms of emergency, more fit for MDBs, and where some of the other options I have highlighted today, which are around procurement agents, management contractor, contract management service providers, and so on and so forth, would be useful, not maybe for the whole country for expediting its own procurement, but at least for the bank finance project, because that's what we are talking about. So that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you, Bernard.
Shall I proceed with the?
Yes, please.
Okay. So let's go now. So the World Bank framework. So I have put a number of references, and for those who are participating, we will see with Kim and her people how to provide you with the proper references you can go to. And I just want to say quickly, you know, basically doing something else than additional financing, retroactive financing, positive list, quick disbursing, additional budget support, supplemental, came in 2006 with a policy which was for rapid response and fragile states. And it had different mechanisms here, an high immediate response mechanism, and also contingent emergency response components in project. And that was basically that any project could be used to help finance some of the emergencies. There were some principle and consideration for procurement in fragile and conflict situation at small states, 2012, about. Policies for situation of urgent need and capacity constraints. There was procurement guidance in 2016, which was updated, and now we talk about fragility, capacity, constraint, conflict, and emergency, so-called FCCE operations, that was revised in 2019. Of course, there is a way to apply in the procurement policy framework for investment policy financing operations, standard investment operations in 2015, 2016. And then I'll finish with the 2020 COVID-19 procedures. So there are a number of documents which can be consulted on the World Bank website to get more information, and we'll provide you with these things. Okay. So what is cross-cutting here for? And it's really something which has been developed in other MDBs as well. So greater delegation, speed, simplicity, and flexibility. These are, this is a motto, so to speak. So support to startup implementation, and in particular, expanded project preparation facility, alternative arrangement for UN agencies and NGOs, pre-qualified procurement agents, contract managers. So that is on the procedural side. Risk and capacity assessment, preferably before emergency, but revisited during emergency, so you have mitigation measures. Retroactive or advanced contracting. Advanced contracting is really not the one which is essential. So retroactive is more important, which allows governments to start procuring, and then the banks may reimburse. Rapid disbursement, and in particular using the quick disbursement, the positive list. Support to counterpart agencies at different stages of the procurement process. In particular, helping prepare TORs, request for proposal, bidding documents, shortlist, whatnot. Delegation of approval authority and issuance of the famous or infamous no objection letter. And shorter corporate-wide turnaround standards. So that's more internal. Oversight and due diligence, and in particular, third-party review and audits, which are really important, and specific procurement arrangements. And methods which should, in general, be limited to the immediate aftermath of an emergency, and until such time you can return to regular. So these were the cross-cutting features which were there. So what are the guiding principles and consideration? And I've listed here a few points, which is to show, to highlight how the bank and banks in general, because that would apply to the other MDBs, have evolved in their thinking. And the first one, and it relates a bit to Ashraf's question, in that the own legal framework authorized special procedures for emergency situations. I suspect that in the cases Ashraf referred to, maybe the laws didn't allow for special provisions, so they just did away with it because that was the only way they perceived to deal. So it's really important. You always have to remember that, you know, a number of things I'm saying here, they may seem to be related to preparedness, and they are. It means that you need to have thought through what you are going to be doing and what you are authorized to do before. You don't invent it when the emergency strikes. So making sure the borrower's legal framework have all the provisions which are necessary. Upfront consultation with UN agencies. What are the appropriate form of engagement and working modalities? They are international agencies. They have their own work programs. So certainly countries are better served by having engaged with them. And in particular, if it comes to how to rely on them using MDB funds. Assessment of national markets, identification of frequently required emergency goods, work services, who are the suppliers, what are the costs. To have these databases are really useful when the emergency strikes. Periodic updating of list of pre-qualified suppliers, contractors, service providers, and in particular the bank, the World Bank has a long list of pre-identified procurement agents, project management agents, and it's actually on the bank external website. It is updated every year or every 2 years. Use of rapid simplified procurement methods, framework agreements, including the existing regional bank, other international organization. So I think there is, I'm sure the heads of procurement will discuss this, how to rely on different framework agreements which may be supported by different institutions. Pre-positioning of supplies and establishments of linkages with international humanitarian depot. That was a bit one of my answers to a previous questions, going more into that direction to avoid quickly unraveling asymmetric dysfunctional markets. So application, so that was to give a bit of the evolution. So let me focus now more on the actual procurement policy and how it applies to these emergency operations. And I have it here in 5 different what are the flexibility measures? Alternative procurement arrangements basically means relying, we will see, but relying on other partner or the border countries' laws and regulations. Hands-on expanded implementation support, that's where the bank get involved itself more directly into the procurement. Market engagement, which is to help identify suppliers, which is really important for the pandemic, so I'll spend a bit of time, and mandatory direct payments pilot. So let's start with the flexibility measures. First, simplified, streamlined procurement arrangement, specific procurement method and procedures, and procurement procedural measures, which is more on the bank internal processes, okay? And here, there is a particular guidance which was revised in March 2019 on procurement. A couple of points which are important. Typically, MDBs and the World Bank in particular would consider emergency procurement only if there was a declaration of a national emergency. This was changed for fast-track emergency procurement, where you can apply flexibility without having to go through this formal process. The other one is the importance of technical and financial audits. Contracting approach, appropriateness of prices relative to market prices, adherence to acceptable practices or emergency procedures, and appropriate use of funds. And that answers a little bit also some of the questions on, okay, what to do. My own personal view is that for every public procurement, audit become more and more important. And for MDBs to rely on procurement audits, which are independent audits, as well as government, is really an important way to go, in particular for emergencies. So on this flexibility, simplified, streamlined procurement arrangement, and in particular for those which are limiting competition and the national procurement arrangement and institutions. So first, upfront, timely, and simple assessment of the procurement capacity and of the risks. So again, that could be in a few days. So I've answered this because it was a question. Simplified PPSD. PPSD is a project procurement strategy for development. It is mandatory in the new policy framework, and it's a very good new feature. But in the case of an emergency, in particular, if you have a contingent project or additional financing, then there is a short-term template and a procurement plan. And that can be done very quickly, again, in a few days. And the procedures allow the completion to be deferred to later during implementation. World Bank execution of startup activities, only of course when there is no viable alternative. And that is very much related, not necessarily so much to the emergency per se, but more to the weak capacity that some countries face in terms of public procurement, and of course, which is made even worse when there is an emergency. And of course, the reliance on procurement agent or procurement or project management agents. So that's on the procurement arrangements. That's more the institutional part. On the specific procurement method and procedure, I am not coming back on this. They are very similar to those I presented above in the features and characteristics of emergency procurement. They are not specific to the World Bank. They have been used by others. And of course, the issue is more in the nitty-gritty of procedures. We don't have time here to go about that, but for those who are interested, they are a lot more. There is a lot more to say about the specific procedures. An important aspect also is that approval should really be limited in time. And one of the danger is that it's simplified, it's simple, it's quick, so it's an incentive to keep using even when the situation has returned to normal. So all these provisions should always be limited in time. And of course, for the World Bank and other donors and financiers, that's something which will always be in the agreements, the binding agreements with the borrowers. And then the procedural measures, again, there will be a lot which could be said here, but let me just say that you need to be looking at how to streamline and provide exception to standard implementation support. That's how the bank review it. And that's more of the internal. A blame for institutions is too much time to respond and so on. In the case of the World Bank, it's clearly laid out that there is increased delegation of clearance on staff on the ground, so those who are in the country offices. No prior review, hence, of course, the importance of audits. Or, if essential, if there are really important contracts which need to be reviewed by the special committees, then it should be within 6 hours. So you see that there are very strict standards which can be set. So, of course, every bank will set its own. The second one here is this hands-on expanded implementation support. That's a feature of the new framework. And of course, it's not limited to emergency because it can be relied upon in cases of weak capacity. And it allows borrowers to request more support from the bank than it usually is done. In the case of emergency, to really help speeding up delivery, but also encouraging more private sector to bid and improve quality. Now, there are no-nos in this. The borrower retains the decision-making authority on procurement. And the bank staff cannot evaluate bids or proposals, decide the award, conduct negotiations or debriefing. These are prerogatives of the borrowers. Sometimes this hands-on can be supported, complemented with probity assurance providers. This is the term which is used in the World Bank policy framework to describe how civil society at large could be involved in monitoring public procurement. So this hands-on, and there are a number of tasks which are described in there. Preparing bidding documents, specifications, identifying markets, analysis of the market, identifying suppliers, anything which is really getting close to the bid process, but not the evaluation. So of course this creates, it's a shift in the nature, in the sacrosanct red line not to cross. I'm not saying it crosses it, but it steps very near it. And so, of course, it creates potentially legal, financial, operational, and reputational risk for the bank. So there are a number of mitigation measures. It's not the scope of the time here to go over, but there are very strict, specific measures. A very clear scope of intervention, independent review of bids, recording of activities, monitoring, reporting challenges and difficulties, summarizing times tasks which have been completing, and so on and so forth. So it's a very unique feature from that point of view. Although, of course, the Asian Development Bank has always, as far as consulting services are concerned, been directly involved in the provision of these services. So you can see how this comes really as an important feature on how the bank may help respond to emergencies. APS, this alternative procurement arrangement, and they basically is that the bank may rely on or apply procurement rules and procedures of other MDBs or bilateral agencies, and letting the leading role be assumed by those in terms of monitoring project implementation and decide on procurement. And that may include UN agencies when they are direct recipients of bank funds and using or using existing APS. Incidentally, as far as MDBs are concerned, there is this whole ongoing discussions and creation of mutual reliance agreements. From as far as I know, some have been signed between the African Development Bank and some European banks, which themselves have signed some with bilateral agencies. The World Bank has not signed yet any mutual reliance agreement, but in the case of the emergencies and these alternative procurement arrangements, it could, so the policy allow it. And of course, the other one is the borrower agency, and that's what used to be referred as reliance on country procurement system. All debate, not one easy to sort out when it comes to legal frameworks to make sure that it can be implemented. So, of course, in case of emergencies, these are really important. And why I mention the UN agencies is because there are framework agreements which have been negotiating with them, which can be used. Now, not everything goes. The World Bank will not engage in any of those without the sacrosanct principle of universal eligibility being maintained. Also applying its anti-corruption guidelines, its right to sanction and audit, and all of those will always find their ways in the supplier's contract, even in times of emergencies. And of course, there is the application of remedies and ineligibility of firms which are temporarily suspended or debarred, or of course, with the co-debarment with the other MDBs. So all of these are principles and characteristics which will not be relieved because of an emergency. So if you are corrupt, it's not because it's the emergencies that you can be. So UN agencies have talked about already. So direct sole source and using standard forms of agreement. We negotiated the first one in 2010 for, in particular with UNICEF, for health-related good. It worked beautifully to facilitate the coordination between the World Bank and in particular the African Development Bank also, which has the same forms of agreement to expedite. So these are still very important. And that is when, but it is to be understood that the borrower is using these standard forms to hire or to select these UN agencies. There can be some indirect financing, but it's a little bit more complicated, so I won't look. So what are the current arrangements? WHO, UNICEF, FAO, UNOPS, which most of you must know, the UN Office for Project Services, which is the one which is really involved in procurement in general, I think. So the World Food Programme, UNDP, which is involved in a lot of emergency things. And the last one is the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. Single source selection, they can do all or part of project activities, and they can also be recruited under trust funds. These are administered by the bank, multi-donor trust fund, or bank surplus funds. And there is a fiduciary principle accord which has been signed with UN agencies, which allows them to basically take over the management of some project or part of project. As I've mentioned, uniquely positioned specialized supplier of critical goods and or advisor or technical expert. I don't spend too much more time on this. To go into the next one, the third one, which is a market engagement, and which is also some specific and new dimension of how the World Bank is dealing with procurement in the emergency situation. And that is really related to the fact that you have either dysfunctional markets or you have poor bidder participation. And so what market engagement means is that the bank will support first, and it answers one of the questions, seeking wider publication of procurement opportunities and approaching the market. So what does it involve? Dissemination of procurement opportunities to embassies. So the bank will rely, forgive me, I sometimes keep saying we, I don't have that hat anymore. So the World Bank staff will engage. You have to know that the 200 plus World Bank procurement staff are for 90% in country offices. So it's really the most decentralized group of people in the World Bank. And so they are those to rely upon to engage with the local constituency when it comes to public procurement, and the best place to identify potential provider or industries representative and to do this market engagement. But there is also the broader one, which I'll talk about the COVID-19 later on, which is conducted by bank staff at headquarters. So helping with this, copies of advertising procurement opportunities, conducting public meetings, business outreach seminars with the private sectors, etc. This is the kind of things which are increasingly done by bank staff, both centrally and in country offices. If there are market concerns about borrower capacity, the bank's role may be also to assuage potential bidder concern and motivate their participation. Putting in place arrangements for publishing procurement opportunities and receiving bids. So the bank may help, in particular, in providing templates and records. And of course, supporting the administration of the procurement process in general. So it's all related to something which the bank and the banks have usually stayed shy of, which is to engage more in the market by helping provide more opportunities and help the borrowers to have a better dialogue, so to speak, with the private sector, and in particular locally. Now, to finish, COVID-19 procedures, streamlined fiduciary implementation, support measures for active bank finance operation. So these are the latest. They have been developed and posted in March, so 2 months ago, and to particularly address COVID-19. Of course, a number of things are similar to what had been developed since 2006. Huh? So first, strategy and planning. And again, it answers some of the questions. Streamline assessment and procurement planning, a few days to do this, to avoid ad hoc, to try to consolidate everything. enhance outreach with borrowers to help them understand what the bank can do in this situation. Further streamline approval processes and timelines within the bank. I mentioned earlier the 6 hours prior review if need be, but it's also the whole approval process in general, and not only limited to the particular procurement. And the market engagement and market assessment, in that case for particular inputs for COVID-19. And I will, I'm not insisting now because I will explain to you what is a bank facilitated procurement. That would be my last slide, which is a unique features that the bank has engaged in because of COVID-19. Procurement risk, capacity assessment and PAD, streamline risk assessment, so again, in a couple of days, leveraging retroactive financing, and one thing which is the use of STEP, which is a World Bank electronic platform to interact with borrowers, is required. And I think it's a good thing because it may seem bank-centric, but in fact, it's a platform to interact between borrowers and the bank, and it allows to document everything. And in particular, in times of emergencies, where there are special process and procedures, it's really important to document everything. In terms of, so streamlined assessments, streamlined approval processes and timeline, supply markets. So procurement risks, streamlined risk assessments, so that's the same thing. Deciding the approach is a third one. So simplest and fastest approach. So the two keywords are really simple and fast. And that is really related to these adapted methods and procedures. And the procurement process, shorter bidding and proposal preparation, virtual bid opening and meetings as appropriate, no bid securities, bid security declarations, relying on e-procurement, increased advance payments, and use of direct payments by the banks, that's an important one. No standstill period, which is a new mandatory feature of the bank, but in that case, it can be done away with. And streamlined contract management, which is, I'm not going to spend time on this, but I just want to say that in this situation, becomes even more important. It's not that you have cut corners during the procurement process, but you have expedited, you have used simpler, so there are more risks associated with these methods and procedures, and therefore it's really important to enhance how contract management is done. Okay, so MPA COVID procurement options, March 23, that's the latest one. MPA is really the multiple process, which is really looking at the long-term agreements that borrowers can have with the bank. And it is really how to consider IPF, which are the standard investment lending, and programming for results, which are the programmatic instruments, the two instruments, how they can be combined over the long term to deal in particular with some emergency. So the additional options which have been prepared for this COVID-19 to enhance speed and access to medical supplies, of course, is of the essence. And it's called bank facilitated procurement. It's at the borrower's request, of course, to help them access critically needed supplies. And because of what everybody knows, the dysfunctional market and the disruption in the supply chains. So the first element is assistance to existing suppliers and negotiating prices on the basis of aggregated demand across borrowers. Of course, there is no fee, no charge for this. So that has really required a humongous effort to get all the procurement staff in the country offices to engage with governments to try to get some degree of information of what was needed. And that was escalated back to headquarters to start this particular engagement of existing suppliers. I don't want to quote names, but some of the big guys, which you all know in terms of medical equipment, the ventilators, the complex one. Not so much the PPE, which have a lot more suppliers. So they really try to focus on the big ticket items. So each borrower then would sign and enter into contract with the suppliers using these pre-digested contracts, including making sure that you have the relevant logistics with the supplier. So the first time was really based on the list of supplies and equipment needed and quantities per country. And those who are participating here from Asian Bank and African Bank know that they have been engaged also on this because they were potential co-financing of these elements. As far as I know, it does not result in any co-financing so far. And maybe, but maybe your colleagues in Asian or African can tell us if they have used some of the information to finance direct contracts also with these suppliers. So the benefits are obvious: speed and access to critical, urgently needed supplies, but of course increased risk because of the proactive role in identifying suppliers and facilitating direct contracts. So this will require, so it's in the making, and I cannot share any more information on this. I know some contracts have gone. Audits will be really essential. Contract conditions, engagement of suppliers, a range of suppliers, which was, I think, and comparison with the UN agencies, speed and prices. You have three elements of the audit post-COVID, which will be carried out there. So that is it for this presentation. There is a lot which could be said, but I tried to summarize it. Kim?
Thank you, Bernard, for your very insightful presentation and the amount of time and work that you put into this for the benefit of everyone here. There's a couple of questions that you did go over in your presentation, but I think it's worth just having you reiterate. So the first question is, emergency procurement presumes that the emergency situation occurs in the borrower's country. How will the bank adjust itself in a situation where the emergency situation occurs in the lender's country to the extent that timely disbursement of funds is affected? Example, prolonged lockdown due to COVID-19.
Does that mean the worry lender, meaning the World Bank in that case, and that because the lockdown in the US, people would not be as efficient as they usually are? I mean, that's how I should understand the question. If that's the case, I can tell you that, well, one of the things you can tell about the World Bank is that it's well equipped in terms of IT. So everybody has, computers, internet, and so on. And I can tell you, being in Washington, that I've been working as a consultant for the World Bank, doing different things, and that has worked fairly well. So I can tell you also that for this bank facilitated procurement, people have been able to conduct this engagement market, because it's basically the market engagement with suppliers which are themselves in lockdown countries, and that has still worked. I think the jury is still out, and at the end of the day, it may show that because of the lockdown, it has limited the ability of the bank to do this bank facilitated procurement. Mm-hmm. But in terms of release of funds, supplemental financing for budget support, additional financing, restructuring, and all of this, that has not been hampered. I'm not saying that like for anybody else, the fact that everybody has been working distantly has not had an impact, but that has certainly not paralyzed the institution.
Okay, thank you. So here's a question. As you had mentioned, 100% advance payment can be made to the bidder in the emergency situation, but how can we protect this amount?
Sorry.
No, 100%
Yes.
advance payment can be made to the bidder in the emergency situation, but how can we protect this amount?
There is no protection. Right? That's, clearly the whole, that's why I've mentioned the risks, okay? And that is because you need to assess the risk. If you do anything under emergency procurement, all of these methods, the direct contracting, if you do away with the principles of the method and procedure, which are usually followed, you take a risk. That's why, the planning to consolidate and know the market and assess the risk is really important. Even if it's only a few days, it's to revisit what is done. And that is, for me, the opportunity to say, that's why procurement planning and risk assessment and market analysis are critical, in particular for the MDBs, not only the World Bank, but also for the countries, to make sure that when an emergency strikes, everything is ready, okay? So emergency procurement is all about risk-taking. Anything which is more flexible would be about that. So if you agree to increase the payment directly, then you have a few mitigation measures, and I mentioned them, which is the testing and pre-inspection, and then the testing and delivery. It is also important to remember that I talked about identified goods and suppliers, so you don't get spam somehow. Now, you have also to remember that in goods, the standard is not 100%, but you pay maybe a small amount originally, but most suppliers, in particular for international shipment, they will charge the rest before shipping anyway. So it's not such a departure. What would be a departure would be to pay 100% a contractor to do some repair works, but for the supplies of goods. Final point on this, it all goes also into one, relying on framework agreements, and you can include the UN agencies in this, because what they have is really framework agreements, because on certain products, that's how they have structured.
Okay, so the question is, in funding emergency procurement, how can value for money be achieved, considering that emergency procurement appears almost like an open check? Compounded to this question, the participant is from a country where the military is currently fighting insurgents, and the military would like to declare procurement related to the war efforts as emergency procurements.
I would say first that, well, it's not a blank check. There are a number of provisions which I have highlighted, which need to be taken care of under emergency procurement. And I said it a couple of times, it doesn't mean that anything goes. And that has to do with the planning, the market analysis, the risk assessment. Also, there are more expedited, the bulk procurement, the consolidation of needs, and so on and so forth. The careful choice of the methods and procedures you're going to use, and everything has to be justified. And then, of course, to summarize, the audit trail. And of course, pursuing the investigation if there is price fixing and or corruption, and in particular collusion. So it's not really a blank check. Of course, as I have mentioned, it means higher risks, and therefore not everything can be prevented or mitigated, but everything can be pursued after, including doing some retroactive thinking on what goes well, what doesn't, and how it can be improved. Better list of suppliers, better knowledge of what is needed in terms of an emergency, what is qualified, what is eligible, how do you procure it, using framework agreement, using e-government platform, and it will increasingly be the way to go. So in 5 years or 10 years time, we will not face the same issues. And finally, these things which I alluded to, which is the MDB is taking the lead with UN agencies in securing certain type of goods for emergency, in particular in regard to the pandemic. So it's not a blank check. Now, as far as the Army is concerned, I mean, the first thing is that talking about eligible expenditures, the World Bank and other MDBs, in principle, there is nothing which can go to military or police or ineligible expenditures. Now, I understand the particular case, but it's not likely for MDBs that part of what is financed will go to the Army. Now, I understand the particular situation where you have some insurgents, I presume in some part of the country. So I would say that the government has particular procedures for the military, it will have anyway. I mean, defense is always escaping the general public procurement laws. That is the one exception. So nothing is different. And if they are fighting an insurgency in one part of the country, of course, the government may have particular procedure as far as the military is concerned to fight these insurgents. But that doesn't necessarily bear on the current, for instance, COVID pandemic. Yeah, of course, the pandemic may be in that part of the country. So I don't see that it would be a significant issue for the MDBs. Of course, for the government, it may be if the Army is trying to use this to get away with procuring things which do not have directly to do with the emergency in a certain way. So that is something which should be resisted in principle. Everything should be procured as per the provision of the legal and regulatory framework to deal with emergency. So that would be how I see it.
Well, thank you, Bernard. And thank you for your time. And thank you for this wonderful presentation. I know you are the world leading authority on multilateral development banks and issues related to procurement and also emergency procurement. And we're very lucky to have you as our course advisor for the International Public Procurement course. So for the audience here, thank you very much for your time. I know in some of your countries this may be rather late, and thank you for spending time with us. And I hope it was worthwhile and useful and helpful information for you. And we hope to see you again either or we hope to welcome you to the International Law Institute in Washington, D.C. this fall. And when everything is ready to go, I hope to be able to visit you in person in your country. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.